My name's Alex Sadhu. I'm the director of the Christopher Dawson Centre. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here tonight for this, what I hope will be a wonderful event, the launch of Tony Abbott's new book, Australia, A History. It's quite appropriate that we launch this book in Tasmania, in one of Tasmania's most historic buildings. The idea for this event came from Luke Powell, who's a passionate history teacher here in Tasmania. And Luke will help us with the Q&A session a bit later on. But I want to thank him and Zach Maxwell, who works for Tony, for initiating the process that's led to tonight's event. I also want to thank Brianna McKee from the IPA, Institute of Public Affairs, and the IPA itself for agreeing to partner with this launch. So I'm very grateful for their support in bringing this event together tonight. And I'll shortly invite Brie to come to the microphone and just say a few words. The IPA is probably known to a lot of you. It's a wonderful organisation that for many years has been fighting the good fight, trying to encourage common sense approaches in Australian politics. A few words about the Christopher Dawson Centre for those who are unfamiliar with it. The Christopher Dawson Centre was founded by Archbishop Julian Porteous, who's here tonight, back in 2013. And His Grace decided to found this centre as a way to promote the Catholic intellectual tradition at a time when Western civilization was really under attack. Its first director, Dr. David Daintree, who joins us here tonight, we're very grateful for David's contribution over many years. And I'm pleased to be taking over and taking the centre to a more national focus. So in the last couple of years, a decision was made with His Grace's retirement imminent to look at expanding the work of the centre. So it's moved its base from Tasmania to Victoria and looking to have a national focus in the long term. So I think we can see the effect of the loss of Christianity on Western society. It's more and more evident. And so the work of the centre really will be to show how that loss is really hurting us and what we can do to kind of restore some of those things that we're suffering from in our current situation. You can visit our website, thedawsoncentre.org. Search that on Google, it'll come up. And please like us on our Facebook page and have a look at our YouTube page. Tonight's event is being recorded, so you'll be able to share that with others who aren't here tonight to enjoy the event. And now it gives me great pleasure to welcome Brianna McKee to the lectern and just say a few words on behalf of the IPA. Brianna is the Research Fellow and National Manager for Generation Liberty at the Institute of Public Affairs.
Well, it's great to be here with you all. I'm representing the IPA, as Alex said, and we are supporting the Dawson Centre in running Tony Abbott's book launch here in Hobart tonight. For those of you who don't know, the IPA is Australia's oldest think tank. It was founded in 1943 as the Second World War was drawing to a close, and its mission was to promote classical liberal ideas in response to the rise of communist and socialist philosophies. And today we still stand for those same timeless principles, which include a free market of ideas, a limited and efficient government, the rule of law, and representative democracy. These principles, we believe, are grounded in our Christian heritage, and they've lifted millions out of poverty and have driven the innovation and the prosperity that characterise modern Australia today. But increasingly, and this is the problem, young people don't understand this. So when the IPA started, much of our focus was on economic policy. But the main battle today is cultural. It's a battle over our national identity and our understanding of who we are as a country. So unfortunately, if you studied Australian history in school today, you would only be taught one side of the story, and it's one focused on invasion, on dispossession and genocide. So to give you an example, Captain Cook, the term Captain Cook, appears only once in the national curriculum database, and that's only for year 4 students. But by contrast, the term invasion, it appears 23 times. And it's introduced to students in year 3, so that comes before Captain Cook. So when you hear these things, it's no wonder that young Australians say when they're surveyed that they wouldn't fight for this country, because you can't expect people to defend a nation when they haven't been taught to value it. So this brings me to Tony Abbott and why we're here tonight. There's no better person than Tony Abbott to write a history of Australia, and he's someone who's fought for this country both inside and outside of public office. And the fact that he decided to write a history of Australia is in itself quite notable, because most former prime ministers write books about themselves. And then, of course, you have Kevin Rudd, who wrote first about himself and then Xi Jinping. But that being said, I do hope that we get an autobiography from Mr. Abbott one day. Mr. Abbott is a Distinguished Fellow at the IPA, and the IPA supported the writing of this book because we believe Australia's history, while imperfect, is something we should be proud of and something we should celebrate. So that's why this history of Australia is so important. It helps to restore balance. It reminds young Australians, especially younger ones, that we live in a good country and a country that's worth preserving. And the reception to Tony Abbott's book, which is already a major bestseller, shows that Australians are interested in their own history. And so tonight is part of that broader effort to reconnect Australians with the story of who we are and to ensure the next generation inherits a country that they understand, that they value, and that they're proud to call their own. Thank you.
Thanks, Brianna, and thanks to the IPA for supporting Tony in putting together this wonderful book. So we're very grateful for all the work that they do in that area. It's now my great pleasure to invite the Honourable Erica Betts to come forward and give a formal introduction to Tony Abbott, who will then speak a few words about his book this evening. Now, Eric doesn't really need an introduction. I think he's probably known to all of you, but just for some particulars, he was chosen by the Parliament of Tasmania to be appointed as a senator in 1994 and served in the Australian Parliament with distinction in a number of roles. In 2024, of course, he was elected as a member for Franklin and has served now with distinction in the Tasmanian Parliament and currently holds the roles of Treasurer, Minister for Macquarie Point, Urban Renewal, and is Leader of the House. I've known Eric for over 10 years, working with him when I was working for Archbishop Julian, and always found him to be compelled by a desire to serve, and I'm very grateful for the contribution he's made in that time when I was working for the church. He served with distinction now in both parliaments and made a wonderful contribution to the nation through those different contributions he's made. It gives me great pleasure now to invite him to come forward and introduce our honoured guest speaker.
Thanks a lot, Alex. It's great to be amongst friends. And as I look around the room, it is good to see that there are so many right-thinking people in our state. And it's great to be able to stand in front of these two banners. One, a great think tank, and the other one, I'm sure, will soon be in the same league as the IPA, just a bit younger, but doing exceptional work. And the founder of that, of course, is His Grace Archbishop. And great to see you here, and thank you for your ongoing work. You have held the flame for freedom of speech, etc. And some of us may recall how he was dragged before the Discrimination Commission for simply saying that which the church believes in. And man of great faith and a man of great stature, and it's great to have you here. And talking about great people with backbone, where is Senator Claire Chandler? there. It's great to see you here as well. Many a parliamentarian was invited to this function, and it's somewhat telling who appears and who doesn't, but Claire Chandler will always be seen at functions such as this. My task this evening is, well, it's not a task, it's an exceptional pleasure to be able to introduce a friend and colleague in Tony Abbott. Tony has embarked upon service to the community. We first met, I think it was in 1977, and we have maintained contact and friendship since then, and of course we're very close as we fought certain people to ensure that we could win a landslide election victory in 2013. I was greatly honoured to be Tony's leader of the opposition in the Senate and then a government leader in the Senate. And opposition, your colleagues elect you. In government, the Prime Minister appoints you. So thank you very much for that appointment. But it was somewhat short-lived, but Tony since then has continued to devote himself to public life, the public discourse, and ensuring that wokeism is exposed for what it is. The fact that Tony even had to bother to write a book such as this is exceptionally telling as to what has happened with the public discourse in this country. Whilst I was still in the Senate, we had a Green senator, Sarah Hanson-Young, asserting that Australia Day was the celebration of James Cook's discovery of Australia. Yeah, that is the ignorance of a lot of people, and you can't really blame her. If she's in public life, she should have known better, but who taught her? Why wasn't she told and taught those basics? But look, you go through Tony Abbott's book on page 33 as a former lawyer, and I see my former partner Roger Curtis in the audience. Great to see you here, Roger. But there was a great case, the first case that Tony Abbott refers to on page 33, and it's the cable case. Husband and wife, convicts, who on the first fleet had their belongings stolen or misappropriated. They took the ship's captain to court, one David Collins, who was the official to decide these matters, and the two convicts won against the ship's captain, and he had to refund them. You know what? Roger, we weren't taught that at law school, but a fundamental basis for our law, equality before the law. If the evidence is there, it doesn't matter who or what you are, the law, and this is one of the great things we have inherited from Britain. Fast forward to page 333 as it happens. Tony tells us about the Hawke-Keating government economic reforms and how transformational they were for our great country. So in the book, he learns so much about Australian history, which should be out there. Another part of our great Australian history is that Aboriginal women in South Australia got a vote for the federation of our nation before women in Europe got the vote. Shouldn't we be celebrating that as one of the great things of Australian history? But of course it goes against the woke narrative, so it can't be. And look, having told you all these things, you might be dissuaded from buying the book, so I better stop because you've heard it all. But can I assure you, it is a great book, worthwhile of your purchase, and what's more, worthwhile for a Christmas present. So buy up big, because everybody that gets that book and even reads one or two pages of it, one, will be better informed, and secondly, we will be broadcasting to the wider community the very real benefits that we enjoy in this country as a result of our history. So without any further delay, can I invite forward the author of the book, the former Prime Minister of Australia, a very good man who has withstood the test of time, is still relevant because of the things he says and does. Please welcome Tony Abbott.
That's great. Eric, it's wonderful to be here. Archbishop Porteous, thank you so much for bringing me to Hobart, and it's good to be here for the Dawson Centre and, of course, for the Institute of Public Affairs, without which this book would not have happened, because I didn't do it all alone. I had a wonderful research team, people connected with the IPA, led by Andrew Kemp, who did a truly magnificent job. Eric, you're proof that there is political life after Canberra. I'm doing my best not to follow your example. But I am really pleased to have been able to do something that I hope will help Australians to feel better about themselves. Because for too long, we have been afflicted by what Geoffrey Blaney called the black armband view of our history. Now, I guess up to a point, perhaps the old three cheers view did need to be somewhat tempered, because our story is not perfect. You'll read early on in the book about the black line here in Tasmania. Not our most wonderful episode, but under all the circumstances, understandable enough, because when you've got a modern society expanding into an ancient world, inevitably there will be conflict, there will be clashes. When we had the British settlers putting up their dwellings, creating their fenced properties, bringing in their herds, their flocks, inevitably in a semi-nomadic society there was going to be misunderstanding. What we need to do, though, is not to judge yesterday's people by the standards of today, but to judge yesterday's people by the best standards of their day. And the interesting thing, even about those difficult times in the late 1820s in Tasmania, is that official Tasmania, from the governor down, wanted to do the right thing by the local Aboriginal people. And I don't tell these stories in the book because you can't tell everything, but the widow of one of Hobart's early doctors was a friend of one of the Aboriginal warriors who helped to lead the resistance at that time, and he was saved from execution on a number of occasions by the intervention of the widow. And throughout our story, there have been any number of humanitarian people who have done above and beyond the ordinary call of duty for the first Australians. If we think of Governor Phillip himself, Governor Phillip was enjoined by the British government to live in amity with the native people because he was a man of great, I suppose, curiosity and humanitarianism. He wanted to get to know the Aboriginal people better. He managed to inveigle a couple of Aboriginal people to live with him at Government House. The one, Kalibi, escaped early on. The other, Bennelong, stayed. Eventually, Bennelong decided to go bush. Phillip went looking for him. And at Manly Cove, in my old electorate, Phillip was in a parley with a group of Bennelong's friends. One of them picked up a spear and plunged it deep into Phillip's shoulder. Now, this is the late 1780s. Arthur Phillip is the governor of a British penal colony. What do you think would normally have happened in those circumstances at that time when a native person had attacked in that way an official? Well, there would have been a volley of musketry, and dozens of native people would have been dead and wounded. Instead, Philip put it down to a misunderstanding. There was no retribution whatsoever, and within a short space of time, Bennelong was back at Government House, and he stayed there with Philip until Philip went back to England. Bennelong actually accompanied him. Was the talk of London for a period of time before Bennelong came back to his own people in the colony. And yes, Bennelong, I suppose, epitomises the spirit of cooperation between the settlers and the first Australians. Pemulwuy, the warrior, who at one stage killed Philip's gamekeeper, was eventually himself killed. He epitomised the spirit of conflict. But it is too easy to see the past in simplistic terms. It is too easy to misunderstand or to neglect the humanity, good and bad, of earlier generations of people. Take someone not unknown to the history of this island, John Batman, later a founder of Melbourne. John Batman's father, a convict, opened a school for Aboriginal boys in Parramatta. Batman grew up with the Aboriginal youngsters of Parramatta. When he came to Tasmania as a pastoralist, he brought some of the Sydney Aboriginal people to Tasmania with him. The Sydney Aboriginal people were more than happy to cooperate in the Black Line because that was the way things were back then. Batman confesses, maybe it's not even a confession, it's simply a matter-of-fact statement in his diaries, that he shot Aboriginal people in cold blood at that period. Yet at the same time, Batman would take Aboriginal orphans into his household and raise them as his own. So yes, a man of mixed character, obviously, a man who did not live by the standards of our day, a man who was guilty of some deplorable, appalling things, and yet it's not a simple story. And we need to tell the whole story of our country, not a partial story, if we are to appreciate the great people we are. I dwell a bit on the Aboriginal side of things because whenever I've done an interview with the ABC on my book, that's all they want to talk about. And eventually I've said, well, hang on a minute. It is an important part of our story. We have an Indigenous heritage, a British foundation, and an immigrant character, but it's not all there is. It's not all there is, and it's not all bad. But when you think of the bigger story of modern Australia, just think, 1,500 souls, virtually marooned, half the world away from everything they knew. A more bedraggled group could hardly be imagined, most of them chosen by the finest judges in England. And yet, within a century, they had created a series of colonies with the world's highest standard of living. Not just that, but it's a wonderful redemption story. George Edwards Peacock, who was responsible for the cover illustration on the book, he was a solicitor in London. He forged documents. He was sentenced to death. That was commuted to transportation for life. He arrived here, was immediately effectively given a ticket of leave to work in the administration of the jail at Port Macquarie. Pretty soon his wife and children were here in this country to join him. They decided that they preferred life in Sydney to life in Port Macquarie. He came to Sydney as a convict, became a meteorologist at the South Head Weather Station, and indeed most of the early weather records of Sydney we owe to him. He eventually became an artist and was given an unconditional pardon in 1847. I mean, this is a story of redemption. We know from our friend Robert Hughes that there was the fatal shore view, but very few of the convicts ended up in Port Arthur. Very few of them ended up on Norfolk Island. For most of them, this was a new beginning which they magnificently made the most of. As Eric has said, by the late 1850s, almost every male in the Australian colonies had the vote, some 70 years before universal suffrage in Britain. In the 1890s, people of both sexes and all races could not just vote, but actually run for Parliament in South Australia. Nowhere else in the world was there a liberal democratic experiment to surpass this one in this country. When we think of our nationhood, no other country on earth has established its nationhood in such a way, not by war, not by insurrection, not by revolution, but by a process of discussion, compromise, and ultimately a people's vote. And the country so established went through the terrible trial, the Federation drought, the disaster of the Great War, the Depression of the 1930s, the Second World War, and then with the wonderful post-war migration, a country which to this day I believe is the envy of the earth, as free, as prosperous and as fair as any. And I hope as a result of this book, more of us might see this country with the same eyes that the rest of the world sees us. A beacon of hope and opportunity, a country to be proud of. Because, and I'll finish on this note, it's very hard to respect ourselves if we don't respect that which has shaped us. Our families, our communities, our country, our faith, our civilisation. And yet there has been a sustained campaign of criticism, mostly unfair, towards our country. If we are to be as good in the future as we've been in the past, we need to learn from the past, not deprecate the past. And that's my object with this book, to help more Australians feel proud of everything that's shaped them so they can make an even better country as we march boldly and confidently into a better future.
Thanks so much, Tony. We're going to have a short break and then we're going to have a Q&A session. Thanks, everyone. Feel free to get up and grab a bite to eat or a drink. If you can do it quietly, that'd be fantastic. So Tony's been very kind to agree to have a Q&A session. And Luke Powell, who is kind of responsible in a sense for the event tonight, is going to kind of lead that. So just a bit of background on Luke. So Luke's a history teacher here in Tasmania at Elizabeth College. He teaches both modern and ancient history. He's also a writer for Quadrant. He did his undergraduate studies at the University of Sydney and then a Master's in Education at Newcastle University. So if you give a warm welcome to Luke and to Tony.
Well, thank you, Alex. We are here in Parliament and it is question time. But as we know, Tony's got lots of experience, so we're going to field some questions from the floor. I'll start off with a question myself, and we've got 15 minutes, so if you could keep your questions short and to the point, that would be great. So my first question, Tony, before we get to the book, is reading has been in rapid decline. I've seen this myself partly as a history teacher, really, with young students. A new Gallup poll, which came out in 2022, actually showed that young people in the last 15 years, reading has declined by 25%. And we've just tipped over for the first time, probably since the printing press first came out, for a majority of adults are no longer reading a book a year. So why should we read, and why should we read history in particular?
Well, it's a very good point you make. The advent of voice recognition software means that we actually could readily fall into the new illiteracy, where no one has to read, no one has to write, everything is just done orally, the way it was for millennia prior to the invention of writing and ultimately printing. I think that the wonderful thing about writing is that it makes you clarify and crystallise your thoughts. And all of the really great speakers have been writers too, because if you write things down, you don't just clarify and crystallise your thoughts, but over time you develop a facility with words, the mots justes, the French would say, to say exactly what needs to be said as economically as possible with as much punch as possible. And, you know, I was lucky enough, I guess, to have great teachers who encouraged me to write even when I was at school. When I went to university, I started writing for the local student magazine. When they refused to publish me because I was too conservative, I started writing for the wider press, including the Bulletin and the Australian. And then I was lucky enough, I guess, to be at Oxford for a time. And the great thing about the Oxbridge method, as opposed to the old days at Sydney University, was no one wanted me to regurgitate the lecturer's notes or the lecture. They wanted me and everyone there to absorb the best that had been thought and said on the topic, and then be able to come back to some of the best minds on the subject with something that was both original, if possible, but defensible always. And so I guess I've long had this habit of writing, and as long as there's breath in my body, I will keep going.
So if we look to the book, one of the, I think the most subtle themes and interesting themes that you bring out is this idea of what is modern Australia. Mm-hmm. And I want to read to you my favourite quote from the book, actually, and get your thoughts on it. You write midway through the book that modern Australia was never a grand design. Mm-hmm. It was the spontaneous product of all those individuals and families looking to make a home or keep one. So I want to ask you, what is modern Australia if it is not a grand design?
Well, what modern Australia is the product of the 27 million people who are here now and all of the millions of people who were here before, because in a sense, all of our todays are a product of all of our yesterdays, and that will in turn influence all of our tomorrows. The great thing about modern Australia is that since 1788, people have been able to come here, originally mostly from the British Isles, but ultimately from all over the world, and make a better life for themselves. And so we are the product not of one man's authoritarian vision, we are the product of millions of people's individual visions, and I think that's frankly a much better way to be. I mean, we can see countries at the moment that are increasingly the product of one person's vision. It might be President Putin in Russia, it might be President Xi in China, but interestingly, no one goes to those countries, everyone just goes away from those countries, and thank God we have always been a country from 1788 that people have flocked to. I mean, the interesting thing, and this is so contrary to the fatal Shaw caricature of convict Australia, the interesting thing, and I hope this comes out adequately in the book, the interesting thing is that almost from the beginning, the convicts were writing back to their kinsfolk in Britain saying, we're actually having a better life here than we would have had in London. In fact, I'm pretty sure this is in the book, there were a number of instances where soldiers, Marines, about to go back to Britain because their tour was over, would commit crimes because they'd rather be convicts in Australia than unemployed ex-soldiers in Britain. You know, we are a country created by people who have voted with their feet for Australia, and long may that be the case.
Absolutely. To pick up on that theme you just mentioned there about convicts, Australia, and the characterisation of us as a penal colony. I know as a history teacher, you teach the younger generation about Australian history, and it seems like we have this almost down and out perception that we were prisoners, criminals, convicts, officers. But you do a large part in your book, and I've got a list here of some of the amazing liberal achievements that Australia had that kind of go against that narrative, and I've got a few here listed in your book. One you mentioned early on is that Lord Sydney opted to have the colony governed by civil law, not military law. The court gave convicts, even those whose death sentence had been commuted, legal standing, as you mentioned before. Our governors followed and implemented and were in fact close friends with the famous anti-slavery advocate William Wilberforce. The secret ballot ended up being called the Australian ballot. The plebiscite also became a landmark of Australian democracy. Full adult male suffrage, this is something Treasurer Betts touched on earlier, but one to add to voting rights is full adult male suffrage came 2 generations in Australia before Britain. In some places in South Australia, as Mr. Betts mentioned, Aboriginal women had the right to vote before British women. And all of this without a war of independence or a revolution, but through slow and subtle reforms, as you mentioned. So the question is, why is it important that we recognise these reforms, which at the time were unlike anywhere else in the world?
Well, it's important that we recognise them, A, because they're true and they happened, and B, because it's actually good for us to appreciate the glories of our past, as opposed to dwelling unreasonably on the downside. Now, I do dwell at some length on the documented massacres, and there were certainly some documented massacres, but let's take the most infamous of them all, the Myall Creek Massacre of 1838, where some 30 Aboriginal men, women and children were butchered in cold blood by a party of stockmen. There was a sequel. John Plunkett, the Irish Catholic Attorney General, who was appointed to that position at a time when Catholics in Britain were still under disability, Plunkett, a man of enormous liberality and humanitarianism, he absolutely insisted that justice be done here. So after the first jury refused to convict, he brought fresh charges against a slightly smaller number of the perpetrators. The judge in the second trial said that this atrocity cried out to heaven for justice, and ultimately the jury did convict, and 7 white men were hanged for the murder of black people. And this was in 1838. Now, ask yourself, what settler colony in 1838 would have hanged whites for the murder of blacks? The answer is none. So, look, we need to see the full story, and the full story is not a story of genocide, oppression, racism, persecution. Yes, the frontier was a dangerous place. It was dangerous for the settlers as well as for the Aboriginal people, but very few of the explorers would have been able to get to where they got without Aboriginal guides. Very few of the pastoralists would have been able to run their properties without Aboriginal herdsmen and Aboriginal women in the homesteads. So it was a story of cooperation and partnership, just as it was one of conflict, and we just need to know that.
Absolutely. So we're going to open it up to the floor now. If you'd like to raise your hand, again, please try and keep the questions short. We've only got 15 minutes, which is a little bit shorter now, but if you'd like a question. Yep, absolutely.
I'm wondering how you look back now on the White Australia policy. As I understand, that was the very first Act of Parliament in the new.
It was certainly one of the very first acts, of the new Parliament. And it's interesting, the strongest supporters of the White Australia policy were the Labor Party, because they thought that non-European, non-British immigrants would undercut Labor and reduce the conditions of the workers. Some of the speeches in the first Parliament were frankly paternalistic, if not out and out racist. Deakin, who was our most significant early Prime Minister, was in favour of the White Australia policy, not because he looked down on the peoples of Asia, but because he feared that the peoples of Asia would outcompete us if they were in large numbers in Australia, to the detriment of what we then called the working class. The most liberal and humane speeches were made by the liberal free traders, who were at times on side with Deakin, at times off side with Deakin. Interestingly, the White Australia policy was put into place against the trenchant opposition of Joseph Chamberlain at the Colonial Office, who made the, when you think about it, the obvious point that why should the subjects of the Queen from India, for argument's sake, not be treated the same as the subjects of the Queen from Australia? And one of the early acts under the White Australia policy was to refuse entry to soldiers of the British Indian Army who wanted entry at various points along the east coast. So look, at the time, of course, other than in Britain, which had a global empire, every country practiced exclusionary immigration policies, and to this day, most countries practice highly exclusionary immigration policies. I mean, you try to become a citizen of Japan, for instance, without being Japanese born, and you won't get very far. I suspect there are many other countries in Asia who might at different times have offered criticisms of the White Australia policy, whose own policies would not be particularly liberal or indeed humane. But, and this is the great thing about our culture and our civilisation at its best, we are restlessly seeking to improve. We want to be better tomorrow than we are today. And it was that same spirit of liberal humanitarianism which ended slavery, which ended transportation, which eventually ended the White Australia policy too. Now, it took some 50 odd years before, under Harold Holt, the White Australia policy started to be relaxed. It was effectively ended in the last days of Menzies' Prime Ministership. But look, not, I guess, something that we today are particularly proud of, but under the circumstances, understandable, and under the circumstances, not entirely unreasonable, but more to the point, something that we have had the good character to end and consign to the dustbin of history.
Yep.
Tony, when was the embryo of the book first conceived, and what was the catalyst for that?
Well, that's a very good question. Sometime in 2020 or 2021, John Roscombe and I did John Roscombe, who was then the head of the IPA, he and I did a couple of podcasts about our present discontents, and we were having and there was a lot to be discontented about during the pandemic, particularly in Melbourne, which was kind of the lockdown capital of the world. And we were just chewing the fat afterwards, and we decided that it would really help if Australians had a better idea of their history, that there was less amnesia or indeed prejudice against our history. And I said to John, well, maybe that's what I should do. Maybe I should have a go at writing a new general history of Australia, which takes at least a glass half full as opposed to a glass half empty view of things. And John said, well, that's a bloody good idea, and the IPA will help. And that's exactly what they did. And now we have this magnificent product.
Someone from the back? Don't want to leave out the people from behind. Anyone?
Can I ask something?
Yeah, sure.
How can you guarantee that you can get those books into the classroom?
Well, I can't guarantee that, because in the end, what goes into the classroom depends upon teachers, it depends upon school principals, it depends upon educational authorities, curriculum designers, and so on. But I would be very, very surprised if any school library that happened to have a copy of this book presented to them would say, sorry, we're not going to have that book in this library. So I would suggest to everyone who would like to see this book in schools that you buy a book and give it to a family member who has got a connection with a school because their children or their grandchildren are going there. Get them to give it to the school library. I'm sure that the school library will be happy to have it.
We've got time for two more. Yeah.
Tony, if you look around the world, it seems very clear that people, particularly in the Western world, are becoming more divided. People are moving either to the right or to the left. And that's certainly true in Britain. The Farage is doing very well. People moving to the right. Trump was in the right place. He captured them all in America. And here in Australia, of course, we've got Colin Hanson and her ready to capture those who move to the right. Labor, of course, is there to have those who move to the left. So it seems to me, well, it's becoming more polarised between left and right. Now, it makes you wonder where an organisation like the Liberal Party, what future it has in that scenario. And my question to you is, what difference do you think this will make?
Well, one of my wonderful Jesuit mentors used to say to know all is to understand all. And I think if people know more, they will be more understanding than if they remain in substantial ignorance. You're absolutely right that politics in the West, but particularly in the Anglosphere, has become more fragmented and more polarised in recent times. I think that is a function of poor leadership above all else. Think of British politics when Margaret Thatcher was around, or even when Tony Blair was around. People didn't say it was fragmented and polarised to anything like the same extent. Think of American politics in the time of Reagan or even Clinton. People didn't say that it was polarised to the same extent. Think of Australian politics in the time of Hawke and Howard. Sure, there were all these issues and problems and difficulties, but I don't think any of us thought that it was a terrible time in our public life. I just think the quality of our public life has declined, I really do, and I kind of hint at that in the last chapter of the book. I mean, think of the front bench, the Hawke front bench. Keating, Gareth Evans, Graham Richardson, whose funeral I went to this morning, John Button, the guy from Western Australia, Peter Walsh, Lionel Bowen, a lot of very, very substantial people. Dawkins, not so sure about Dawkins. He was the guy that wrecked the bloody universities. But anyway, but still, they were substantial. They were substantial people. I mean, think of the Howard front bench. Costello, Reith, Minchin, Hill, substantial people. And the other downer, the other thing that characterised the Hawke government and the Howard government in its heyday was no leaking, no backbiting, no people demanding to be promoted after 5 minutes in the Parliament, this kind of thing. And look, if you look back at history, not just our own, but if you look back at history more generally, while I guess I do have, in a sense, the Whig interpretation, I think over time things do get better. But by geez, if over 1,000 years they're going to get better, in any 100-year period they could get worse. So maybe we're just going through one of those lesser periods, and I think I do suggest in the last chapter of the book that we are only one or two good leaders and one or two good decisions away from much better times.
One more. Yeah.
Tony, I did national service and served in Vietnam, and I despair with the state of our defence budgets. And if we can't defend our country, well, what have we got? I can't possibly imagine any young parents now agreeing to let their 19-year-olds get caught up for conscription. And I despair a bit for patriotism in the country as a whole. What are your thoughts on the current situation with looking after the defence freedom of this country?
Well, it's a very good question. I wonder how many Ukrainians in 2010 thought that they would fight and die for their country, and yet enormous numbers of them have. And Ukraine is not a country as blessed as Australia. If you wanted to be critical of Ukraine, you could find a lot more reasons to be critical than we could here in Australia. My instinct is that most of the youngsters of the early 1900s didn't imagine that they were going to go off and fight and die for Queen and for King and country, but they did. Ditto, I dare say, the children of the Depression didn't think either that they were going to go off. They were physically tougher people, I've got to say, and I think there was a robustness about people's attitudes to life and death then, which is less in evidence today. I mean, the pandemic was, I think, our overreaction to the pandemic was a manifestation, I thought, of the modern mindset that death is to be avoided at absolutely all costs, unless you want to commit suicide by lethal injection, in which case it should be permitted. But the truth is that we should never let fear of dying stop us from living, and there are always got to be things that you are striving for, even at great risk, or prepared to strive for, even at great risk. And my instinct is that were we ever called upon as a nation to make sacrifices, we would rise to the challenge, perhaps in ways we can't possibly expect right now.
Well, thank you, Mr. Abbott. I want to end on one last question, and it's to do with the second half of your book and probably a great inspiration to your own political life, and that's the time you dedicate, I think it's over 2 or 3 chapters, on Sir Robert Menzies, a longest-serving Prime Minister and, of course, the founder of the Liberal Party. And you quote his famous speech in 1942, or the radio address of his The Forgotten Peoples. And I've got a quote here from the book, which you reference from Robert Menzies, and I think it sums it up quite well. And this is what you wrote down from Menzies. He says, "I do not believe that the real life of Australia is to be found either in great luxury hotels or petty gossip or so-called fashionable suburbs. It is to be found in the homes of people who are nameless and unadvertised, and who, whatever their individual religious conviction or dogma, see in their children their greatest contribution to the immorality of their country?
Immortality, I hope, not
Immortality. The immortality. Good clarification. So I wanted to ask you on that quote from Robert Menzies, who are the forgotten people of Australia today?
Good question. I think it's families with children still. I think in my maiden speech I said that families with children are the new poor of Australia, and it's still the case that families with children are forgotten, particularly intact families with children. So look, I hope that again, by going back and reminding themselves or learning for themselves the best that's been thought and said, the best that's been done, the great things that have been achieved in our country, we will be more minded to do it again.
If you could please join with me in congratulating Ms. Rabbit. Thank you.
Thanks again, Luke, for doing that. It was a wonderful Q&A session. Thank you, Tony, again, for making yourself available for that. Now I'll call upon Archbishop Julian Porteous just to offer a vote of thanks to Tony for this evening, and then we'll wrap up tonight's event.
Tony, firstly, thanks for coming to Tasmania. I sometimes feel we can be forgotten or a little bit ignored, perhaps. So I think we Tasmanians are always very pleased when somebody of your stature and your desire to communicate with us here in Tasmania eventuates with you coming down. So firstly, thank you for coming to Tasmania, and I think the people here tonight have come because they're very grateful, firstly, for your leadership in our nation, your contribution particularly through this book, but also because you thought of us down here in Tasmania. So I think that'd be true. We want to thank you. Tony, writing a book on history, I think, reminds us of a truth, and that is that a knowledge of history, particularly to understand the flow of history over time, and because more particularly to know the flow of history within your own country, helps you know who you are. And I think that is one of the great contributions this book makes immediately, to know who we are. We can't really know who we are as Australians in 2025 unless we have a sense of our history. And I think the great sadness in the present moment is that many young people are growing up without that knowledge of history. And that's why your book, I think, is so important for us. I've been occasionally dipping into these ancestry shows. I'm sure many have as well. I find them fascinating, actually. And of course, when people, you watch the person as they discover the background of their family, as they start to learn of individuals in their family tree, they of course do sometimes come across moments of a bit of embarrassment or a bit of a shadow in the family tree. But also as you see them discovering who the characters were that preceded them, you always get a sense at the end they are grateful for and appreciative of the struggles that their ancestors went through and the achievements that their ancestors made. They have a sense of appreciation for the family. So people in exploring their heritage are often deepened then in their respect and appreciation for those who've gone before. That's why we need a book like this. We do need to see our nation's history as a whole, not only the events of history, not only to record the sequence of things that occurred in history, but as you've done tonight, Tony, I think it's a real feature of the book. You're talking about people. You're talking about the way different people responded to circumstances. And I think it's very true that people respond to circumstances within the reality of their own time. that you've captured that. And so you're presenting us with a knowledge of our history through people that really gives us a greater appreciation and respect for them. If we don't dwell, we don't want to deny that there have been failures, and you've mentioned some like the One Australia policy, for instance, tonight. We realise there have been those failures, those shortcomings in our history, and there are the shadows and the embarrassments. But I think your book brings out what we've achieved. And what we've achieved, you brought up very eloquently even tonight as you spoke. What we've achieved here in Australia is something great, something special, something remarkable. And it hasn't come about, as you said, by somebody driving us down a particular path. It's come out of the people, it's come out of history, it's come out of individuals. We are who we are because the people have gone before us. And so we can be very grateful and have deep respect for those who preceded us and what we have inherited today. This is what you've done in your book, Tony, and you have this clear stated intention to look at the glass half full and not the glass half empty, that we might appreciate and be proud of our history, and we appreciate and be proud of the culture that we have, despite the fact that at the present moment there is a polarisation, there are many struggles we're currently engaged in. Now, I know you've attracted a little bit of criticism here and there. I did read a number of them. But I'm sure there are many, and I'm sure this room is full of fair-minded Australians who really will appreciate what you've done. Appreciate your efforts to reflect on the essential good that we can find within our nation and its history. And so, as you've done, you've spoken about the fact that, and you've said this many times, and it captures it very well, that we're a nation that have an ancient peoples. We have a nation that has been founded as a modern nation with the arrival of the British, who've given us patterns of democratic government and the rule of law, and you've quoted some wonderful examples of that. And we recognise now, particularly the great contribution of many peoples from so many nations who want to make Australia their home and have enriched our cultural fabric. This is Australia, this is who we are, this is our heritage, and this is the basis upon which we can grow and develop in our future. Tony, thank you for undertaking this work. I know and I hope that this book will be read by everybody here, including myself, but more importantly, I think we need it to be read by the young. We really need to have the young people, this generation of young people, to be able to read a book like this. And I do hope it finds its way into libraries. And I hope too that, that this book will help all who read it to have a greater knowledge of the flow of our history and to find a greater appreciation for who we are, where we've come from, and how much we owe to those who've gone before us. Now we know there have been moments of failure and shortcomings, but overall, I think we can look at our history and I think very honestly say, I am proud to be an Australian. I'm proud of my nation. I am proud of my history, despite its failures and shortcomings at times. Now, for those here tonight, I can sort of say, I think Rebecca's already said it, this book, of course, will make excellent holiday reading. So, sitting by the beach or wherever you are in January, here's your bed, great chance to get stuck into this book and to read it. And I think it also will solve a number of gift challenges that you might face at this time of year. So start thinking about, oh yes, this is what I like to give to so-and-so, because I'm trying to think what to give them this Christmas. But I think more importantly, as I said before, we do need to get this book into the hands of young people. So maybe grandparents can think of grandchildren, parents can think of their children and say, I really would like you to read this book. Because we need to get this story out. We need to get a balanced, fair, and inspiring and encouraging account of our history so that this next generation, like us, will be proud to be Australian. Tony, thank you very much.
Thank you, Grace, for your kind words there, and I certainly confirm that. Just a few short words of thank you to everyone who's assisted with tonight. So, firstly, again to Tony, thank you. To Eric for your kind words of introduction. Tony, to Brianna and the IPA, thank you again for your support for Tony to write this book and for co-sponsoring tonight's launch with the Dawson Centre. We're very grateful, so thank you again. To Luke for your fine Q&A session. I think it was really valuable and gave everyone a bit of an insight into some of the things that are behind the book and Tony's thoughts on a range of issues. Also, I'd like to thank the parliamentary staff here tonight for letting us in and for feeding us and keeping us well hydrated, so thank you for that. We hope this might be the first of many collaborations between the Dawson Centre and the IPA, so look out for that. We can certainly keep in contact with you through email addresses and the website, so please be aware of that. And thank you all for coming, making the effort close to Christmas. I know it's a busy time for families as they prepare, so thank you again for coming tonight. Books are still available for sale at the back, and Tony's still happy to sign until we get kicked out. So please feel free to take any food and drink on your way out and books. And again, thank you all for coming tonight.